Hey guys, got an interesting game to share with you today. This is one I actually played late last night. Went to bed, couldn't quite sleep, and ended up picking up the iPad, and I was going to just drill through my normal openings against the computer maybe, and a challenge popped up. So this is from a new chess.com friend, Hops09, who's rated around 950, and came up with a 30-minute game. I thought, why not? Let's do a 30-minute game. And I think this is quite an interesting game. One reason is that I've been suggesting the Pirc King's Indian setup certainly for beginners playing black, because it's very easy to remember and it's pretty solid and it's a good way to get into the game. However, in this game, my opponent plays that setup against me, and I was able to dismantle it and pretty much destroy it relatively easily. And the reason is because I know how to play against that setup. Now, I think two relatively equal rated players, it might have been a different story. But just work through this with me and you'll see how... I mean, obviously every kind of opening or system has its strengths and weaknesses, and I was able to exploit the weaknesses of this King's Indian defense setup. So we'll go through it. So we start with e4 and then d5. So the Pirc defense, you might call it the Pirc. So I play d4. Clearly, my opponent's offering me the center, and this is I would say probably the key feature of this King's Indian setup, which is that you, as black, you do not challenge for the center straight away. So it's one of the kind of hyper-modern styles of opening, where you don't challenge for the center from the start. You build up your forces towards the sides of the board, and then you try and break for the center later on in the game. Okay. In this case, though, it doesn't work out too well. So we have knight to f3, knight to c6, and now knight to g6. So I know what's coming now. So if you look at control of the board, or particularly controlling your opponent's half of the board, so I'm controlling 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 squares with my knight. Okay. So one definition of space that I've heard people use is space is how many squares in your opponent's half are your pieces looking at, right? So right now, I've got my pawns looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, and my knight's looking at that one, and also b5. So I'm looking at 5 squares in my opponent's half of the board. Black, however, is, because his pawns have only moved 1 square, they're still only guarding his own half of the board. So with this knight move, black is controlling 1, 2 squares, and then also this bishop 3, 4. And I think that's it. Okay. So now bishop to d3, and this is a kind of I did think, well, maybe should I put it on c4, because obviously we've got a little light squared mini pyramid here, getting ready for the bishop and the king to castle behind. So what is the purpose of this move? What is the future for that bishop? But sometimes it does just make sense to line up your piece not against a weakness, but against where a weakness might appear later in the game. And I just felt like, if I bring my bishop all the way out here, it's just likely to get kicked and have to retreat. So I thought solidity is the name of the game. Apart from anything else, it's late at night, my eyes are blurry, I haven't got my glasses on, right? So I thought, let's try and make life easy for ourselves. Okay. So, black now plays bishop to g7, absolutely fine. And now bishop to e3. So continuing the theme, this is just very, very conservative and robust. Now we have castles. Now, if you are playing against this setup, there are two main tactical motifs that you should be bearing in mind. Okay. One is, and basically it's all about attacking this formation. Now, clearly, because this pawn has already advanced 1 square, this pawn is now a hook, which means it's a target that you can pick out. And if you can try and remove this, because this is an advanced pawn, okay, so a pawn on here, f5 or h5, could prompt the pawn either to move out into danger or to swap itself off, thereby exposing the king. And that's one of the dangers of having a king and a fianchettoed bishop, because the king is no longer defending the pawn that's in front of it, which you might argue could be the most important pawn. Right, so that's one thing, and then there's a couple of ideas for this, but the main one really is to send the h-pawn up the board. Now, if you then combine that with kingside castling and get this rook over to here, you might then back up a pawn storm, ideally using fg and h, okay, backed up by rooks and maybe the queen as well. So that's one thing that already at this point I'm starting to consider. The other main motif is, you see, because the pawns have arranged themselves onto these light squares, okay, that means that their control over the light squares around the king side is strong, right? Because all of these are actually defended, yeah, and the knight's defending that and that. So the light coloured squares are very strong on this side of the board. However, as a consequence, inevitably, the dark squares are pretty weak, right? Nothing defending a lot of these squares. Okay, king's defending that, and the bishop's defending a couple, but compared to the kind of lattice, the grid that we saw on the light coloured squares, it's a lot harder to get through on the light squares. So the other motif that you need to think about is maybe lining up your queen and your bishop with the idea of dropping your bishop there into h6 and forcing this guy off the board. Because if that bishop leaves the picture, then suddenly these dark squares, you know, you can feel the wind blowing through, if you know what I mean. Okay, so I play queen to d2 with that in mind. Two purposes to this move, obviously. One is it gets my queen and my bishop lined up on that dark diagonal. The other one is that it opens up space to castle queenside, because I now want to use these guys and fire them up the board. Notice at this point that I have not developed my knight, which would very often go to f3. Now, if my knight's on f3, it's going to be in the way of this f-pawn, and I want to use these pawns for a pawn storm. So we have knight c6 and white castles. Now, this I think is an error on black's part. So what black's doing now is aiming to fianchetto the light squared bishop on b7. And this is unusual because my king has just moved here. And so this bishop, if this bishop ends up here, it's going to be on this long diagonal, looking at the opposite side of the board from my king. Yes, it might be looking at that rook, but for me, I would say that with a board like this, I mean, this bishop here would be good. It'd be looking down now at a2. Even the bishop coming to here would be looking at this rook. You know, might even drop back to h5, something like that. But the bishop generally wants to be on the opposite corner of the board from your opponent's king. Okay, but we have b6. And now I push f3 because my idea is this. I want to push this pawn up the board. I want Harry to go on his merry way and take out this key defender, right? It's not a complicated strategy, this, right? And it's, you should have an idea in the middle game, and we are now practically in the middle game. I haven't developed my knight, but I'm holding my knight back. So as far as I'm concerned, this is middle game time for me. Okay, but I can't send Harry up there straight away, because if Harry gets to here, we've just got knight will just take him out. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to get a pawn onto g4. But again, I can't put a pawn straight on g4 because it's got a knight and a bishop looking at him there. Okay, so f3 is required. This is a patient approach, right? A lot of beginners will try and start attacking with pieces, one piece, two pieces, and that is not enough to deliver a convincing attack. So, and now we have bishop b7. Okay, so black is pursuing this kind of line of inquiry with the bishop, but I mean, just see what kind of future this bishop has as the game unfolds. So, I now play a3, and again, this is a patient prophylactic move. Why do I play that move? Well, I just don't want to see the knight coming in here. Right? I like my bishops, even though this guy is still staring at these light-coloured pawns. I don't want this knight coming in there and swapping off my bishop and getting my queen off of that diagonal. Right? So I just want to say to black, look, if you've got any ideas about that, you can forget about it. Right? Come up with something else. Okay. So I use my ninth move for a prophylactic move. It also, this pawn can also sometimes be a target. It's defended only by this knight, and should this knight move, I don't want a queen or something jumping in there. Okay, so rook e8, and that's it's a sensible move, particularly if you've got intentions of pushing a pawn break in the middle of the board. It also gives the king a second square, maybe to run to if need be. And now the attack starts to happen. g4. You see, the knight cannot capture because the pawn's been defended by f3, and we're only on move 10 here. And now e5. Now, let's just rewind a little bit, all the way to the start of the game. Remember how I got these central pawns, okay? Central pawns, good control over the center of the board, all right? Now, what I notice here is that with these pawns here, and with black's knights both developed to these natural squares on the 6th rank, I had already spotted that should either pawn come up to the 5th rank, that I could very happily, let's say this pawn comes forward, I can play e5. Hit this knight, win a tempo, knight has to move. That would be very, very good for me. I want this knight out of the way, right? Likewise, if e5 comes, I can push d5, and we've got pawn gridlock again in the middle of the board. Okay, and this knight is being hit, this knight has to move, and also remember now, this knight can't come to b4. Okay, so we have e5, d5, and the knight now moves back here to e7. So that's not a fantastic place for a knight to be. It's providing no defensive support at all. It can't move to any of these squares, and it's a long way from white's king. So for me, I would say that this pawn push was unhelpful for black, and you have to say to yourself, if I push that pawn, what is my opponent going to do? And is that going to work out better for me or worse for me? And I think clearly here, black's position has become worse. This bishop now looks really stupid because it's staring down 3 light squared pawns, and this knight is blocked the rook's control of the middle. So now I play h4, and now again, the other knight now moves. I mean, is black worried about g5? See, in general, I would normally advise, if you see this threat, if you see it coming over the hill, right, wait until your opponent plays g5 before you make your mind up. See, right now, this knight can't go here, or here, or here, or here, or here, or here, right, or here. So really, the knight only has one move right now. But think about this, right? If I play h5, so no, if I play g5, right, for example, the knight can come here to h5, where it's protected by a pawn, where it's helping in the defense of the king. Yeah, this is like a knee-jerk reaction. Oh no, I better get my knight out of the way, right? And again, this knight has moved to this horrible, horrible central position, where it's slightly better than its buddy, but it hasn't got great prospects from that point on the board, right? These knights are really, really bad right now. So I now develop my knight to h3. And the idea here is that at some point I might drop my queen in here. Let's say this is the ideal scenario. Let's say bishop takes, queen takes. Now my queen is on h6. Then my knight wants to come in here, checkmate threats. Okay, there, whatever. Okay. So, and now the rook comes back from e8, back to f8. So that's 2 moves. We're on move 13 right now. 2 of those moves have been wasted. You might argue that these knight moves have not been very productive either. And now the bishop comes in. Okay, so this is the idea that I mentioned right at the start. It's the reason why I put my queen from d1 to d2, is to back up this exact move. Okay, so black does not bite, black does not exchange bishops, but f5. I don't like this move. A general principle is, unless you are really forced to, or unless there's a very, very good reason, leave the pawns around your king the hell alone. Hands off those pawns. I've got a video called Hands Off Those Pawns. Watch that video, right? The way I look at this board right now is white has a bishop and a queen, right, and a knight, and potentially 2 rooks behind a bank of pawns, all attacking over here. Okay, this is the way it's flowing right now. If you look at black's position, black's got a king, a vulnerable bishop, and a rook. Everything else, all these guys, are playing no role in the defense of the black king. They're in the wrong side of the board. They're in the wrong place to help with the defense. And now this move here, f5, prompts g takes f5, clearly. Not only am I capturing into the middle, but I've now got a semi-open g file, and I'm attacking g6. Right? So it's going to, any time now, any moment now, one of these rooks is going to come onto the g file, and we could find ourselves with the pinned bishop, all kinds of problems. So g captures, and I ignore this pawn. This pawn is not material in terms of the attack, because I have an immediate pin opportunity. This bishop is now pinned. The bishop cannot legally move, so the bishop can't take the bishop, and I'm threatening, obviously, say bishop takes bishop, and then bishop moves away and grabs something with a discovered check. King has to move. We'd have to move here, and it's all starting to go horribly wrong. So bishop to f7 is pretty much forced now to defend the bishop. There's no other good way, or maybe no other way whatsoever, really, to defend this bishop. The only other kind of option would be knight c6, sorry, knight g6, but that falls to e takes f5 or even h5, and the knight's then going to be forced away. Okay, so rook f7 pretty much forced. Bishop takes, rook takes, and now pawn takes on f5. Because I'm perfectly happy. If he wants to swap off rooks, that's fine, because that's basically almost his last defender here. Okay, and now we have knight takes d5. That's not a problem for me whatsoever. If anything, if I could just throw a grenade and obliterate all the pawns in the middle of the board, happy days. I'm fine. I've got my 2 rooks here. This rook is standing there with its hands in its pockets. This bishop is sitting on its hands on the bench, right? My pieces are suddenly starting to look kind of threatening now, right? They're all looking towards black's king, and that's what you want to be doing in chess. So we swap off rooks, and now rook g1 check. And at this point now, this king is really, really feeling a cold breeze. Right, it's so exposed, and these pieces are all in the wrong place. So we have king h6. Now I don't know if my attack was as accurate as it could be here. And now this knight comes into f6, and this knight turns out to be really the hero of the piece. Okay, this knight, it looks like a fairly quiet move, but it's defending. Stopping my queen from coming to h5 with check. It's stopping my queen or my rook from coming to g8. It's actually doing really quite sterling work, and it's defending this pawn. I'd love to just grab that pawn, right? Love to get the king onto the back rank, get the rook in there, win the queen. I can't, because this blooming horsey is in my way. So we have now knight to g5 check. So now I've got two attackers on this pawn, and the king's in check by a knight. If the knight can't be captured, the king has to move, because you can't block a check from a knight. And now I come in knight e6. Okay, so I'm trying to solve this problem of this bugger here who's in my way. Now, yes, I could have just grabbed the pawn. Okay, and a beginner probably would just grab the pawn, maybe attack the knight, but then we're going to have another knight replace it. If I capture that knight, this knight's going to come up. And then what's that doing? It's actually creating some space here that the king might use to run away. I don't want the king to run away. I want the king trapped. So now knight to e6 is played. So I'm attacking the queen. And there's a risk here. What black would love to play would be queen e7. Just bringing the queen. I don't know if the queen's even moved in this game so far, right? But bringing the queen to the defense of the king. So if a queen comes in here, we can capture and trade off, and yeah, we're okay. However, the queen can't really go there because of knight c7 with a fork on king and rook. Okay, and notice my king has been sitting there just sipping tea this whole time, just with his binoculars, just watching what's going on. That is exactly what you want in a chess game. So queen to c8 is forced to defend this pawn. And now I bring in my other knight. Okay, this bishop, as we've seen, was not actually required. Although there were opportunities from here. For example, the bishop could have come in there with check and create a bit of a crossfire. But then I figured, I don't know, with this bishop come in, it's possible. I could have brought that bishop in. But anyway, so now this knight comes in here, right? So yeah, the bishop could trade off, but that wouldn't be good because then we're looking at the knight, the rook in the corner. But this knight's also threatening to take out this knight. So the bishop does actually capture, and now my bishop actually has a small bit part in the play. Rook moves across to b8 to save itself, and now bishop to c6. This is an instrumental move. Notice how all of my pieces are now threatening black's king in some way. Okay, queen's threatening to come in. The knight is covering some horrible squares around here, right? And now my final piece, the bishop, and this rook's been threatening there all along. Pawn to a5. This is a move of desperation. There's really nothing else that can be played. And can you see the final move? Okay, so white has mate in 1. And the move is queen to f8 mate. It can't be captured by this knight because this knight is pinned by the bishop. So there you go. Some key ideas if you are playing if you're playing against the Pirc King's Indian defense. So if you see this coming, you know what's about to happen, okay? So you know what your general ideas should be. And my ideas started to develop themselves really from this point in the game, okay? Especially when this pawn comes forward, you know exactly what's going to happen. You know that bishop's going there. You know the king's going to castle that side, all right? So already from move 4, I'm thinking, right, I know where my bishops need to be. I know which side they need to be pointing at. I know roughly where I want my queen. I know that I want to hold this knight back until this guy has come forward, because I want a pawn storm up that side of the board, and it all worked out perfectly in this case. Okay, queen there, castle there, and the rest we've already seen. Okay, so I think that was a pretty solid game by my opponent. Some questionable moves. I think fianchetto the bishop here with this pawn move, totally unnecessary. Right, this is like a defensive structure with your bishop here, right? But why? I'm not attacking that side of the board. I'm attacking this side of the board, right? With all the king's horses and all the king's men, right? That's the problem, you know? So this is kind of solid, but what's he attacking? He's attacking nothing at all. He's attacking fresh air down there. So this, I think, was an error and a waste of 2 moves, okay? I also think this pawn push prompting me to block up the middle of the board, making this bishop completely useless on there, and forcing this knight to move away, right? That was a mistake. And then finally, f5, I think, was just a kind of a lunge when it really, really, really didn't work out, and certainly didn't help Black's cause. Okay, so that, my friends, is how to play against the Pirc main line. It was a King's Indian defense setup. If you are a Pirc or King's Indian defense player, study this, because you need to know how to defend yourself. One idea sometimes can be to play h5, for example, to stop the h4 pawn in its tracks. But more than anything else, think about where your pieces are at on the board, and make sure that your king has adequate defense. If you are playing white and you see this kind of system come up, now you know what to do. Okay, there you go. Thank you for watching. Please do subscribe to Chess Bootcamp if you are not a subscriber, and I'll see you soon.